everyone, and welcome to our first week's lesson. We've been looking at newspapers and researching newspapers, and it's one of those topics that you could actually do a 4-week course on, but we're trying to squeeze it all into 1 week. And I want to go over a few things that we didn't talk about in the text portion of the lesson. And specifically, I want to look at some articles that feature women to give you some ideas. I want to look at finding aids and just give you some other tips and tricks for researching. So let's get started. Now, you've already looked at the types of newspapers. I'd like to just go over this real quickly again for you because I think it's important. We often think about newspapers in relation to what we know, and that might be a city newspaper or a county newspaper. But you need to be open to the fact that there can be all kinds of newspapers that could have covered stories involving your ancestor. You know, when I think about where I live, we have a city newspaper, we have a county newspaper, and then we have a regional newspaper that includes our city and everything south of us. So it actually covers 2 counties. So that's important. If people were, 100 years from now researching our area, they would need to know about that. So it's important for you to know what is being published where your ancestor lives. And not all of these newspapers are going to be found in the same place. Now, besides those kind of location-based newspapers, there's going to be religious newspapers. Some churches put out newspapers, and so that might be something to look into. There are ethnic newspapers, and some of these that are English newspapers, some of them are a foreign language newspaper, but they were published here in the United States. Now, Genealogy Bank, which is a genealogy website that has digitized newspapers, has various ethnic newspaper collections. They have an African American one, they have a Jewish one, and some of those newspapers are in Hebrew. They have a Spanish language newspaper collection, a German language, they have Italian language, so they have quite a bit. So that's something you would take advantage of if you have an ancestor that fit one of those categories. Now, let me just say this though. If you're looking at a Spanish language newspaper, obviously, and this is probably going to seem kind of dumb for me to even say, you do need to search in Spanish. So just keep that in mind. And then there's military newspapers. I think most of us are familiar with the Stars and Stripes. There's also organizational newspapers. There's special interest newspapers. And what kind of comes to my mind right away is suffragists. They had newspapers, and some of those are available via the subscription website Accessible Archives. They also, I believe, have a collection of abolition newspapers as well. There's academic newspapers for, the student body of a university. And there's also business newspapers. So there's a lot out there. And I think it's important for you to know that, to identify what would have your ancestor in it or possibly, and to see where are those located. Now, I kind of struggle with, back and forth about whether to talk about this in any detail. That the different kinds of articles that you should be knowing about and be aware of that your ancestor could be in. Because today, I think the majority of genealogists probably spend 90% of their newspaper searching time online, where you literally don't have to know what you're looking for to find it, right? But I think it's still important to know what types of newspaper articles are out there, because when your ancestor is someone who should be in those articles, you would know to look for them. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to show you some different articles about women, and I'm doing this because I think it's important for you to know what's out there and to become more informed about what's available, and obviously the rich resources of newspapers. Now, before we get into different types of newspapers, you want to kind of consider the stages of life, right? Depending on our stage of life, we're going to be in different kinds of newspaper articles. If we're young and we're not married and we're children, then we might be in articles that have to do with our school, for example. If we're getting married, we might be in an article about our engagement or a marriage license list, the wedding. We may later, if things don't go well, be in an article about the divorce. And then as we get older, we might be in articles having to do with our career or our children or even milestone events. And then obviously there's widowhood, where you might be in articles like your husband's obituary. So that's all important to keep in mind as you search. So think in terms of what's on her timeline, right? Now, obviously, birth, marriage, and death are on people's timelines. So that's important. There might be other events, too, that she would have a newspaper article about her. What are the milestone events that she might have lived through? Things like a 25th, 50th, or more wedding anniversary, for example. Or did she live to be over 70? That could be considered a milestone event. Was there 4 or 5, probably 5 or more generations alive at the same time? Maybe there was a photo taken, for example. What activities did she take part in? Some of these have to do with membership organizations. It might have to do with her kids' school, with church, but what activities did she take part in? Also consider her memberships and whether those are for her only or as auxiliaries to what she's doing. And then we always want to consider our relationship to other people, because that might also lead to other articles. So, for example, a father or a brother-in-law or sister-in-law, something like that may have also resulted in articles. All right, so let's do the fun part, right? Let's look at what some newspaper articles look like for women. And I realize this is really small, and I apologize for that, but the article that I have put in red is about a little local group, and they're spinsters. So what this really means is I think it's a group of college-age women who weren't married yet, and so they had a little group that they would get together, and obviously once you got married, you were no longer in that group. So I bring this up because sometimes things our ancestors took part in don't exist anymore. And that's important to know. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And reading the newspaper for their area can give you a sense of some of these things. And I know that's a lot of work, but it can be really worth it. Now, this is part of the Women's Activities page, which is kind of a social page. It's the women's page, which you would expect to see things like women's groups and what they were doing. Sometimes there's wedding announcements. As you can see, there's tea time topics and all kinds of stuff in here. And so newspapers often have these women's pages that cater towards their interests. Now, maybe she was named something or awarded something, like this example of Mrs. Elias Compton. Unfortunately, we don't have her first name, and she was Mother of the Year. Now, this is a good point. This is a great article, but we don't have her actual name. And as I pointed out in our materials, you need to search by her husband's name as well. So keep that in mind. And here it talks a little bit about, what her kids are doing and all of that. There's obviously more to this article. I had to cut it off. But this is a great example of what might be out there that we have no idea. Now, some of us are lucky to have ancestors that had some sort of milestone event. And I love this one because this one has to do with being married for 69 years. And it starts off with the love affair of this happy old couple. And it's a whole, discussion about them. And basically they were having kind of a family reunion or a party. So that happens as well, that you get these articles for these milestone events and they accompany family reunions or some sort of get-together. Now, truly, newspapers are the equalizer, and this is a good example. This is a list of letters left at the post office that people need to come pick up. And sometimes, this is, 1840, but sometimes these letter lists are segregated by gender, sometimes not, like in this case, they're not. And you can see sometimes it just has a woman's name, and there's a few cases where it says Mrs. In fact, there's one where in the middle there where it's just Mrs. Barr and no first name, so we don't know what her name is. But these can be great because they might indicate to you that your ancestor moved, for example. So they could be really important for you to check out. Now, I just love newspapers, and these are some of my favorites. And I'll keep saying that even though, you might be thinking, how can everything be her favorite? That's a good question. But these are the missing husband ads in the personal notices. So your husband takes off, whether he does it on purpose or something awful happens to him, and you may not know what happened to him. So, there's no cell phones, there's no GPS tracking devices, so who knows? And so as a woman, one of the only things you can do besides reporting it to the police is to say something in the newspaper. Now, there's all kinds of these missing husband ads. This is one such example. In this example, in fact, the bottom one there, information concerning the whereabouts of H.L. Hooyer, who disappeared August 13th, will be thankfully received by his wife, Mrs. H.L. Hooyer. Now, in the case of Hooyer, I actually did additional research on this and wrote it up on the Genealogy Bank blog. I found this notice and more notices about this in Google Books. He was actually a saddle maker, and his union's journal printed information about his being missing, and then eventually it was decided that he had probably been murdered. So obviously sometimes these missing husband notices are because something nefarious has happened, but not always. Sometimes it's because of an affair or something. So these can be important. Once again, be cognizant of how names are in the newspaper because, we don't really have much here. We have H.L. Hooyer, so we don't even have a first name. And then the wife is Mrs. H.L. Hooyer. So keep that in mind. My guess is, too, looking at the first one, initials when you have very limited space and if you're paying for these personal notices might be important. In this top one, we have J.D. Allen, who left his wife at Rusk the 10th of June and has not been seen since. And at the very end, it says to address correspondence to his distressed wife. So we don't even get her name. That's why it's important to always search by his name as well. Well, maybe some of you women are feeling kind of peaked, or depending on your age, you may have various ailments. And so Lydia Pinkham is someone who historically was able to solve those with her vegetable compound. In fact, it's still sold today, so you could go take a hit off of it today. What I love about Lydia Pinkham, she's one of my favorite businesswomen, is she came up with the idea of having testimonials. And so she would get these letters from women who said, oh my goodness, what you sell is a miracle worker. And then she would put them, their names and their addresses in the newspaper. So this is a great example because it's not only their name and address, but it's also their photo. So could you imagine finding your grandma in one of these? This is wonderful. So I'm showing it to you because I want you to consider all parts of the newspaper. Sometimes we get so stuck on, the front page or the women's page or one of those that we forget about the advertisements, and they can be equally important. Now, you may think, yeah, these are probably actors. These actually are real women. In fact, one of them I did some research on and found her in the census. So these are not actors. And she actually did use real women who wrote to her and talked about how they benefited. So. All right. Now, sometimes women do things that aren't very nice, right? And in this case, this is an example. This is Mrs. Florence Carmen, and this has to do with a famous kind of one of those crime of the century cases. On the left is part of a newspaper article. It's, you know, with newspapers, especially pictures, they don't come out very good. And on the right is a photo of her actually from a newspaper collection through the Library of Congress photos collection. It might even be the Bain collection, which are newspaper photos. She was the wife of a physician and became convinced that her husband was having an affair with a patient, and so she killed her. So this was quite scandalous. She's, you know, kind of a society woman, and she killed this poor woman. So, you know, I put this in here because obviously sometimes newspaper articles might be shocking to us and might tell us something we didn't know before. And obviously that can be difficult, but it's important that we find those, and also to remember that newspapers tended to sensationalize things, so you would need to do further research beyond just what the newspaper said. Here's another good example of a milestone event, and I love this one because she's the oldest old maid. And so she was a spinster. She hadn't married, and she was over 100 years old, and not ashamed of it. So it's fabulous, and it talks about her and her family and all kinds of stuff, and it's just wonderful information. So that's why when you look at the people you're researching and you look at maybe your timeline or a family group sheet, if you notice that they obtained a pretty good elderly age, you might want to see if there's an article about that in the newspaper. Now, at this point, you might be saying, why is Gina showing us paper dolls? Well, this is why. Let me introduce you to Tilly the Toiler. She, I believe, was an office worker. And at some point in the comics section of the newspaper, there were these paper dolls that you could cut out and play with. Well, the cartoonists would invite their readers to send in designs for these paper dolls. And as you can see at the bottom of this page, they not only gave them credit by name, but they also included their street address. And so this is a fabulous example for this woman who sent it, or child who sent it in. Minnie Santel on 116 Greenwood Avenue, Cannon City, Colorado. I've even seen where if two people sent it together that are related, like let's say sisters or cousins, it would list that relationship. So it's just fabulous. You know, this is a great example of genealogically rich content in the newspaper. Unfortunately, because it is not typed, it's kind of handwritten there at the bottom, you may not find it in a search. So that's the only bad part about this. But I wanted to show you just some of the examples that can be in the newspaper. Now, in particular, these women or children who drew these designs, some of them were children, but some of them were women, married women, who did it as well. So it wasn't just one group or the other. And I'm assuming the cartoonist helped with the designs. Now that brings me to OCR, or optical character recognition. And this is the way that you, when you do your search, that it can find the information that you're searching. And one of the things I pointed out in the course that I want to point out again is digitized newspaper websites. The search engine doesn't know a first name from a last name. It's just looking for matches to the characters you've typed in. So keep that in mind, especially when you use a website like Genealogy Bank, for example, where they give you spaces for first name and last name and all this stuff. The system doesn't know what a first and last name is. In fact, you can put the whole name in the first name box. Now, there's problems with the OCR, obviously. You want to consider things like letters that look the same when they're typed, because that's what newspapers were, right? Typed. So E and O, for example, can look the same. Maybe even throw in a C in there. Papers get smudged, they get torn, so there's all kinds of things that can make it very difficult for that OCR technology to find the article that you want. Now, like I mentioned before, you can ignore the search box for the most part, so you don't have to do first and last name in separate boxes, for example. And I always recommend that people search, when they do search, they search broadly. So you may maybe just try the name and see how many hits you get. And then add a place and then see how many hits you get. Then add some dates. Now, this isn't going to be as effective with a common name like Mary Ann Smith, but it's something to consider, especially if you have a name that isn't as common. It can help you, to find what you need. If you start off very narrow and you fill in each box in the search box, that's going to affect whether you find what you need or not. So just remember, it's best not to fill in all the search engine boxes there are. Now, I mentioned this in our course content, but it's extremely important. Remember, you need a list of all the various ways that her name could be listed. Remember Mrs. H.L. Hooyer? It's the same idea. And I added the men because if she was married, we have to consider what his name was and his name variations in order to find her. So this gives you just kind of a little bit of an example, and I just, I included some different ways to write John. I added initials. I went and added some vague stuff. I'll tell you my favorite, and I'm saying this ironically, is one of the women that I'm researching. She and her sister were what we would call spinsters. So they were very active, but in the newspaper they're listed as Miss Proby. Well, they're both Miss Proby. And their other two sisters are Miss Proby until they get married. So that does absolutely no good when I'm trying to figure out who the article is about. All right, let's talk about some finding aids to help you find the newspapers that you need online. Now, I'm mentioning this, and I mentioned the names list and all of that because you should be making your own research guide. And that's going to help you as you research your female ancestor. And that research guide should have everything you need to be an expert in that place. What libraries exist, what archives exist, what newspapers existed in that area, what websites are they on, that kind of thing. Here's two finding aids that I want you to be familiar with. One is, they're both volunteer efforts actually. One is the Online Historical Newspapers website, and the other is the Ancestor Hunt. Now, it's important that when you type in this into Google, you type in the Ancestor Hunt. There is a website called Ancestor Hunt as well. Now, these are, like I said, volunteer efforts, and the volunteer who runs each of these sites, they find links to various newspapers and they make them available online. They tell you whether it's a free site or a fee-based site. The difference for the Ancestor Hunt is he also includes tutorials. And so some of the tutorials have to do with locations, some of them have to do with a certain website. So that's important for you to check out. I highly recommend it. Here's another one that might surprise you. This is Wikipedia, and it's a list of online newspaper archives. And as you can see, it's the world. And you can kind of see there on the left, it has Canada and it has the different provinces, but this is a site to find various newspapers online. So I thought I would add it in there in case that might be useful to you. Public libraries are increasingly digitizing their collections and then making them available online. This is a good example. This is the Casa Grande Public Library, and there they have some of their local newspaper. So you might see this in conjunction with newspapers.com. I've seen them work with public libraries to do this. Most of the time these efforts are free, and so you can just use them. You don't have to have a subscription fee or a membership or anything like that. Though for a lot of libraries, if you have the library card, the barcode on the library card gets you into various databases, and sometimes that includes local newspapers. Find is a search engine for historical newspapers, but it only has certain newspapers. So make sure to go to the top, to the list of titles, and make sure that it includes the newspapers that you need. The other thing is you could go into Google Books, and we're talking about this more in next week's lesson, and you could look for these books that were published that talked about and listed all the newspapers available at that time. And I've given you kind of a screenshot of one of them called the Newspaper Record. This was a listing of newspapers and periodicals for the U.S., Canada, and Great Britain. So that's another way for you to learn what's available for where your ancestor lived. Now, that doesn't mean it still exists, but at least you would know what's available. Now, here's the Library of Congress. This is a great website because it's public domain newspapers. You can download them. It doesn't have every state, but it has most of them. But the real beauty of Library of Congress's Chronicling America is over on the right where it says U.S. Newspaper Directory 1690 to present. Now, the first U.S. newspaper was printed in 1690. This is an index of what's available. Now, not necessarily online, but what's been published and where you can find that. And so you click on that, and there's the directory. It's browsable and searchable. So you could browse if you knew the title, or you could search the state and the county and or the city. You can also search by a keyword. And one thing that I noticed is I was looking for Spanish language newspapers. So you can see there at the bottom left it says Ethnicity Press, and you can choose Spanish. And when I did that, I got about 15 results. So not very impressive. When I went and just entered the keyword Spanish, I got like 1,800 results. So I'm not really sure why that is, but my point is always make sure that you search different ways before you give up. Oh, and I should also mention that the newspapers that you find through that search or through that directory are not all on Library of Congress's website, but they do tell you where they are located. Now, one of the things that's available and that's free is through Google News. And we used to call this Google Newspaper Archive or Google News Archive, and that doesn't really exist the way it did anymore. Google every once in a while decides that one of their services is not part of their mission, and they stop putting more effort into it. And that is true of the Google News Archive, which was their effort to digitize newspapers. So this is Google News. So this is an aggregate of the current news stories. But this is Google News's newspapers that they actually had scanned as part of this larger project. And you can see that you can scroll to see titles, you can click on one of the letters, or you can just search. Now, what I like about this is it tells you how many issues and what the dates are. So you're very clear on what they have available. Now, here's the problem. Because quite a few years ago, Google decided they were done with this project, there isn't a really good way for you to search or for you to get a copy of what you find. So just know that once they decided to stop improving it or stop adding stuff, they didn't do anything more to it. But if you go through here and you find newspapers that are important for your research, this is a great resource. So keep it in mind. And I have the URL up here in case you wanted to jot that down as well. So where should you look? Because remember, not everything's online. In fact, in some cases, you may have to go crank microfilm reels. You may have to look at those big copies that are bound. So these could be at libraries, they could be at archives, digital collections for libraries and archives, historical and genealogical societies, and museums. So they can be almost anywhere. So keep that in mind. All right. I hope that gives you some things to think about. Obviously, that's not everything there has to do with newspapers, but I wanted to give you some more tips and some ideas so that you can continue on, and hopefully you'll do that now, searching for your female ancestor in the newspaper. I'll see you next week.